Hi all and welcome. In today's video I'll be discussing this super cute illustration as I paint to test out this new watercolor sketchbook that I recently purchased on Amazon. It is the Travelogue Artist Watercolor Journal Sketchbook. They have a variety of sizes and I chose to get the grand portrait size, which is 10.5 inches by 8.25 inches. There are 60 pages, 30 front and back. The journal is pretty slim and it has like this elastic band to help close it, and a hard linen cover. The cover you can actually paint on, but I highly recommend that you gesso the cover prior to painting on it. Gesso will provide you with a decent ground so that your painting doesn't just soak through the linen and you're not using a million layers to try to achieve the effect that you want with your paint. So keep that in mind. I'll list any and all supplies used in the description box below, such as my Daniel Smith colors that I use and my Windsor & Newton watercolor paints that I use. So let's get to the painting.
Alright, for this particular illustration, I started out by sketching the character out in a smaller sketchbook that I use when I travel. This was about 2 months ago. I figured she was a simple and cute enough character to paint for the sake of testing out this paper. I initially sketched out the drawing in this watercolor sketchbook using my Prismacolor Col-Erase pencil in terracotta color. These pencils have been a recommendation by fellow artists, so I've been testing them out over the last few months. And I'd have to say that I do like them quite a bit. I have a lavender one that I tend to use more often in my sketchbook. Because of this illustration, I do plan to purchase a darker purple Col-Erase pencil, and you'll see why soon. Okay, so I don't typically do paint swatches as often as I should to test out the colors, which I'm trying to change, but I did use a few while doing this painting to try to get a grasp on what colors I wanted to use for her coveralls. And you'll see that on the left side of the screen. When it comes to me choosing watercolor paper, it's super important that I'm able to layer a lot. So that's one thing I wanted to test out with this Travelogue paper. This particular type of paper is 95 pound cold press, and I typically work on 140 pound cold press paper. So the weight had me a little concerned that I'd have issues with the tooth of the paper holding the pigment, or with the paper peeling as I layered. I didn't have too much trouble with it, but it did concern me just a little bit. In terms of watercolor paint brands, I use the tubes of Windsor & Newton Professionals. And I actually purchased these tubes way back in college several years ago. I paint almost every other day, and I find that it's kind of remarkable that some of these tubes still have usable paint within them, and that they've lasted as long as they have. Of course, I have replaced a few like ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. These colors I use religiously to try to achieve different darks. Mixing ultramarine blue with a bunch of with different colors can help you a lot when it comes to the values and the tints and tones. I tend to use Payne's Gray and Violet to achieve my darks now, though, because they seem to offer a bit more dimension. I find that black can be a bit too harsh when I'm looking for a softer image. I've also been trying to expand my color palettes and experiment with different brands, because after trying out some Daniel Smith watercolor samples that my mom received in a sketch box, I am hooked. I'm a creature of habit, so I do stick to the same sort of earthy tones in my work, even when I try to avoid them. I do this for a variety of reasons, comfort being the number one. Then there's the fact that I paint a lot of flowers, trees, and foliage, or maybe it's because I'm an earthbending Taurus who likes brown and green. Who knows? Had to toss in some nerd culture there for you. So, naturally, the first Daniel Smith color I purchased was Quinacridone Gold in Earth Tone. It's a sort of beautiful tawny golden brown color that works out super well with painting skin tones. So one of my favorite parts of this painting ended up being the little girl's hair. I named her Stella for some reason. That name just popped up in my head when I woke up this morning. I love painting different hair textures, and painting her hair allowed me to experiment with layering different tones. I used burnt sienna, burnt umber, and violet. One thing that I tend to struggle with while painting is achieving a certain level of vibrancy within my painting, so starting off by limiting my paint palette to brighter colors should hopefully aid in that. With that said, I do really want to try my hand at a lighter and brighter color scheme, I guess by using more pastel colors. So I'll be experimenting with some gouache sets that I have, and I'll definitely be purchasing more Daniel Smith watercolors while painting or attempting to paint with a more limited palette. So here I'm just doing a bit more layering to try to achieve the complexion I wanted for her. I did struggle a bit with the paper when it came to layering because I found that the color was lifting in some places, so I did have to break out my hairdryer at some point because the paper was starting to pill on her arm. You can see that here a bit. I guess that my watercolor method could be considered wet on wet because I don't generally allow my paint to dry between layers. This is partially due to the fact that I will 9 times out of 10 have the ceiling fan on in my studio. So I guess I'm kind of working in the middle of wet on dry and wet on wet. Sometimes while I'm in the middle of a painting, I'll end up doing a bit of line work to sort of break up the image so that I can see sort of what I'm doing a bit better. I don't use ink very often because it seems a lot harsher for certain watercolor imagery and it interrupts the softness that I'm aiming for. So I almost exclusively do line work using a fine-tipped watercolor brush, and I use Payne's Gray and Violet mixed together so that it's not just a one tone. For some reason, and I'm not sure if it's the paper or not, the lines ended up being much more abrasive than I like, and Stella gets a little horror movie-esque, and I hated it, but I left it alone to see if painting in more layers on the rest of the painting would make the lines look less harsh. This did not work. She still looks like a little monster girl. So I go in and I douse water on her face, and I use a paper towel to start to lift the paint at some point. Here you can see a bit what I'm talking about in terms of pilling. You'll see some dark spots on her coveralls and her arms, and that's where the paper was kind of beating up and pilling off of the page as I layered. Alright, so here you can see where I'm starting to lift the harsher lines. In my opinion, the paint lifted a little too well. Usually there's a bit of a struggle to remove paint after it's stained the paper fibers, but Stella's creepy face came up a bit too easily. I'm not necessarily complaining about that because it was certainly helpful in this instance, but it's one thing to consider when painting on this paper. So after I lift her face, I end up going through and softening the harsher outlines of her hair. Following that is when my trusty Col-Erase pencil comes in, and I start to outline the painting to see the shapes and form a bit better. And I ended up really liking how the purple illuminated the figure and provided the softness that I was after by providing a sort of halo effect, if that makes any sense. I also dug out my normal Prismacolors and I used the violet one to help with a little bit of line weight and to give it a little bit more depth in certain areas. So overall, I do really love how the painting turned out. I did have issues with the color lifting a bit as I tried to layer, but it was tolerable. In some places I did have issues with the paper peeling, so I do bring out my hairdryer to dry the pages a few times. If you're someone who likes to overwork a painting, this book may not be for you. The weight of paper will definitely not accommodate that, so keep that in mind. The paper seems to be good for gouache and other mediums too, so I am going to be testing those out. Here I'm adding a bit more depth throughout her hair to sort of illuminate on the fact that her hair is thick and curly and full of texture. So I'm using Payne's Gray, and I'm throwing in some ultramarine blue and some more violet to add some color. At the end, I used my white Posca fine tip marker, paint marker, to add in a few highlights, particularly in the eyes, so that she doesn't look very creepy or dead. And then she was done. I don't have too much more to say right now, and I'm hopeful that you gained a bit of insight while listening to me ramble on. Thank you so much for watching. The video goes on for a little bit longer. Do me a favor by liking and subscribing, and I will see you soon.